Hi everyone and welcome to the big Indy night in. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Stuart Cosgrove. Stuart, hello and welcome.
Hello, Allan. How are you? Great event. This fantastic. Well done, you.
Thanks so much. And well, listen, thank you so much for being part of it. I know you're a busy man, so it's really good to have you involved with this. So yeah, we'll just have a quick chat about a few different issues. But I just wanted to start off, and obviously, I know you best for being a presenter off the ball.
Yes.
A bit of an institution on Radio Scotland. It's been on the go for 26 years, but it's only been good for 25 years.
Yes.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a curious thing about this because I joined the show 25 years ago, and as you implied there, I shaped it into the work of broadcasting genius that it is now. But I think its real success is predicated on the fact that it's pretty close to its audience. I mean, it's clearly a show about Scotland, for Scotland, and with lots of guests who are either Scots or live in Scotland. And in a way, I think that we are fairly starved of public service media. Although there are channels there and whatever, I sometimes feel that we don't really get the shows that we deserve. And I'm not by any means using Off the Ball as a flagship for that, but Off the Ball is something that's found its unique tone. And there's endless people that come to me that are living down in England or over in Ireland who say, I tune into the show, and they don't really have a lot of Scottish connections, but they can feel its kind of friendliness, its warmth, its humour. And I'm fairly proud of it. I mean, there's obviously things about it I would always change because I'm a little bit restless when it comes to media and formats and forms. But, you can't be as successful as that show's been over 25, 26 years without it touching a nerve for people. And I think that was slightly kind of underlined during the worst of the lockdown, when people really were effectively not even leaving their own homes. And so therefore radio took on maybe a heightened and enlightened kind of place in people's life, and we were able to access a lot of the people that were involved, not least Jason Leach, and communicate pandemic messages in a more informal way, rather than the daily formal briefings, which had to be by their nature fairly straightforward, information heavy, and the media would ask Nicola Sturgeon and her ministers questions that were intended to really, trip them up. Off the Ball was doing something different. It was asking about real people and what their issues were. So typically that might be, the man whose daughter was getting married, and it's his job to book the venue and pay for it. And he was looking to a marriage maybe 6 months away. Was there any chance that this would happen? And Jason Leach was having to let the guy down and say, I wouldn't actually put your money on it now.
I think that's become yet another Off the Ball trope, is actually Jason Leach saying, I'm sorry, you can't go to the wedding.
Yeah. And it's one of numerous tropes. And I think that all great media needs its tropes. It needs points or little nuggets of kind of reference that people can go to. And sometimes they can be throwaway things, and sometimes they can be more substantial. But Off the Ball, it's got attitude, it's got comedy. And I think one of the strong things about it is that neither Tam Cowan nor I support Rangers or Celtic. So that therefore has made it historically the voice of the Diddy fans,
Well, I was going to ask you about that. Do you ever get fed up having to talk about Celtic and Rangers so much? Because I understand why it happens in the media and in the newspapers, that if you mention Celtic and Rangers, people will read it. But do you ever get fed up having to? I mean, you do your bit about not talking about them, but do you ever get fed up having to always focus on that?
That's a wee bit like asking an independence supporter if they ever get sick of talking about Boris Johnson or Margaret Thatcher or the Norwegian oil fund. I mean, there are certain things that you have to talk about in order to get your attitude over. So yes, Celtic and Rangers are there, but they're there almost as a kind of point of kind of satire, rather than necessarily because we are immersed in them or obsessed with them.
Yeah, just a final point on that. I mean, I think that to go back to what you said about the role that Off the Ball's played throughout lockdown. I mean, you've read out lots of correspondence from listeners about how the show has been a glimmer of light in an otherwise very dark year. Was that something that you were aware of, or something you planned for?
Well, you know, we didn't plan for it in the sense of sitting down and saying, let's make ourselves kind of the listener's choice of the time. But Tam and I did one thing, which was, at the time, the BBC had put out very extensive protocols for shows being presented from people's homes. You've seen hundreds of different shows that have moved on to Zoom or have been done by some kind of different kind of platform. But we knew that our studio in Pacific Quay, which is a fairly sizable studio, was big enough for us to socially distance. And we asked the BBC, we pushed them to let us record in our studio as live as we would do. And they put in place COVID protocols and, you know, the gels and the social distancing and the wipes. And actually, curiously enough, the most difficult thing of it, Allan, was that the engineers, the people who technically get the show on air, had a smaller engineering booth, so they had a one in, one out policy, a bit like going in and out of lifts. And once they managed how that would work, they said, right, you've now got permission to be on air in the studio. And it gave us the kind of belief that what we were doing wouldn't have a lot of technical hitches and wouldn't be something that would feel strange, because quite a lot of the show is almost like in any kind of live show. I have all the time to be taking information into my ear from producers, but also being able to look over at Tam. And sometimes we move on to what's next without even saying the word what's next. I just give a signal to him and he picks up on the hand signal. You can't do that if you're in two separate locations. And I think the show would have suffered. So I'm really, really glad we insisted on doing it in the live BBC Pacific Quay studios, you know.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, is that it was that did give people that sense of normalcy, that it was just, you know, there are some, it was almost like tethered people to their life before lockdown, because it didn't change and it was consistent. And you obviously maintained that the unpretentiousness that comes with that show as well, which...
That's right.
I guess
and one of the things that we put in is the talking point every week, coronavirus and Scottish football. We were always looking for a story of that week, or a series of stories that week, where the COVID had either impacted on clubs, or it had meant in most cases that we were behind closed doors. Then, of course, there was opening of the games up because the TV rights were being allowed. So the behind closed doors games with no fans. Then Tier 1 with Ross County and Cove Rangers and other areas, Elgin City had fans in. And so there was always something to talk about within the culture of coronavirus, you know, and that was useful as well, because we could keep it in the show without it always being one of these slightly kind of sonorous public service message type broadcasting, you know.
So you're grateful to the Aberdeen 8 and volleyball and goalie then for keeping...
Hey, do you know what? I'm actually in dispute with them today because the Aberdeen chairman, Dave Cormack, said in the papers this morning
I saw that.
that Jason Leach had been on off the ball more than he'd actually spoken to Aberdeen. And Dave, I mean, Dave's one of these kind of, you know... he's one of these chairmen that supports his club and argues for his club, and rightly so, and fans want that of their chairman. But he tells a partial truth, Dave. You know, he says the government has done nothing for football. Well, the government turned round and said football can return in order that you can get all your TV money, which is probably about 45% of Aberdeen's income. He's, you know, to say that that's nothing when that's been what an awful lot of leagues across Europe have been doing as well, seems a bit uncharitable. That being said, you know, he has to support his club, and he's doing that, you know.
Yeah, of course, it's his prerogative, his agenda to put forward the best interests of Aberdeen. But no, I want to move on. I want to talk about your latest book, Cassie's Sex.
Yes.
It's been really, really great read. what struck me about this is, and I think a lot of people who pick it up will maybe get a bit of a surprise in many ways, because you think, right, I'm going to read a bit of a biography about Muhammad Ali, and it's not really about it. It's the context, and it's the world that he exists in when he moves to Miami, and changes from being Cassius Clay, and all in the context which moves him to being Muhammad Ali. So how important was it for you to approach it in that way?
Well, I think that the way that I write is I'm fascinated by context, by social circumstance, by coincidence, by people kind of cohabiting in the same space at the same time. And often what it is, and you know, my great passion in life is soul music, African-American music of the 60s, the 70s and onwards. And because of that passion, I'm always looking for connectivity, for where is this record from? What studios was it made in? What were the social circumstances of that city at that time? I'm working on a project just now, which is about a town in southern Illinois called Cairo. It's spelt Cairo, like the capital of Egypt, Cairo, but it's pronounced Cairo. And for a period of time in the 60s and early 70s, it was officially the poorest city in the whole of the United States, you know, and was the target of a lot of civil rights campaigns or whatever. Now, it's not a big soul town in the sense that it didn't have a lot of artists living there or whatever, but I'm fascinated by why was it that the poorest place? What were the circumstances? What can we take from that and divine from that? So I guess that my instincts to research and to dwell on things and to dig down on things, right? So just as before I hooked on to talk to you here, the civil rights group that were protesting, it was a hunger march led by the Reverend Jesse Jackson and his Chicago-based Operation Push. And they were running this civil rights campaign throughout Illinois and ended up the campaign in this town. Their campaign slogan was "Hunger is a hurting thing." Now, I knew that about 20 soul records of that time used the expression "a hurting thing." Usually were called things like "Love is a hurting thing" or "My life is a hurting thing." It's kind of like an African-American street expression of that time. But I'm probably the only person in the world that would dig deep into the bowels of record collections to find the 4 records that are called that. And it just gives the books a greater sense of kind of authenticity, or a greater sense that research has happened and that you're reading something that's deep. So the Cassius book is clearly about the young life of what became Muhammad Ali, but by zoning in on the period of time when he's converting to Islam and when he's actually living effectively as Cassius X, one of the requirements of Islam being that you eliminate your slave name and the X becomes your mark of elimination, whilst he's also training to fight Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship of the world. It's a great moment, a great era. There's actually been a movie and a stage play called One Night in Miami, which uses a similar technique, but I wanted to go slightly further than just that one night. I wanted to look at the kind of 6 to 9 months running up to it and to bring in a whole range of other relationships. So the books are often very much set in a place at a time in which Black music is thriving for one reason or another.
And that seems to be a time that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to be quite obsessed with that time period.
Yeah.
And it really is, you know, well, you can tell me, but I'm assuming that maybe started off with the music, but then but that music, and it is the context all wrapped up in the politics and the political movements and the people. It really is, you know, the whole sphere, that whole movement. And is that when it started? Did it start off with the music?
Yeah, well, it started off, I mean, very simply, it started off with my love affair with Motown and soul music as a young boy living in Latham, where I grew up in Perth, and I was 15, 16-year-old when I fell in love with that music. And soon thereafter, about a year later, I started my higher modern studies, and my modern studies teacher, who's a woman called Lorna Campbell, Miss Campbell, saw when we talked, I talked about my obsession and my interest in soul music and Motown. And she said to me, well, why don't we shape your year around the civil rights movement and start to look more deeply into this as, you know, the politics of it rather than just the music of it. And I said, wow, that would be great. I didn't think that you could ever do that. I didn't even think you could ever shape your education, let alone, you know, that you could choose something that you were already passionate about. And she sent me off on this. She'd encouraged me to read certain books, go to the library, meet up with her for a tutorial. And it was also, modern studies also had that thing where it was training you to go to university by understanding that you had to take responsibility for your education. You would go to seminars, but you weren't going to sit in a classroom for 7 hours a day being told what to think by a teacher. And I found modern studies, I still do to this day, I think modern studies is one of the shining lights of the Scottish education system. I think it says to our young people, be ambitious, be different, look around the world, study things like, in my case, civil rights, but that could have been anti-apartheid movement or Black Lives Matter or the transgender rights debates. These are things that kids now are studying in their modern studies, and that's a really, really good thing for a healthy, modern, democratic Scotland.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And if I was absolutely murdered at school, but there were only two subjects I actually enjoyed and actually did well in were modern studies and English, actually.
Yeah.
Because that, you know, we learned about apartheid, and we learned about civil rights in America, and it just opened up my eyes to this new world, and it was just absolutely fascinating, and a great place to learn. And yeah, I couldn't agree more with you about modern studies in Scottish education. But one of the things I just, you know, to thinking about the civil rights movement at that time, it was a revolution in many ways. I think it was very much a revolution in the way that people campaigned as well. People organised themselves to campaign, and it's really fascinating. I mean, I had just before we started chatting, I had a thought started to develop in my mind about the civil rights movement is essentially, you know, it's a fight for civil rights, but against a broken democracy. And I wonder if you can see any sort of parallels between that time, that movement, and where we are now in Scotland. I mean, in the context of a democracy that doesn't work for our country.
Yeah, well, look, I think there are a number of comparisons to be made. I mean, first and foremost, you know, we're two white guys. We enjoy immense privilege in our lives in the sense that there is not anything structurally that discriminates us against us in the workplace and housing and all the rest of it. And the civil rights movement was about changing that inherent kind of bias against African American and people of colour. And so for that reason, I'm sometimes nervous about making comparisons. But one comparison I would make is that the civil rights movement, certainly the Southern Christian Conference, the leadership conference that Martin Luther King led, was effectively, by its nature, democratic and peaceful. It tended to kind of be Christian in the purer sense of that, the small c Christian, and it tended to be against violence because he was very much a pacifist. He'd studied in India under Gandhi. He was a great believer in the idea of social change through peaceful means. But elsewhere in at the time, certainly with the Black Panthers, with the invaders in Memphis, the Blackstone Rangers in Chicago, and also with the Nation of Islam in the area of Muslim culture, there were quite a lot of more kind of, pro kind of nationalist change organizations, many of whom were armed, right? And so kind of if you look at Scotland, Scotland is very, very close to democratic change. I don't know a single person of any credibility in the run-up to Indy F1 or since that has advocated violence, that has advocated armed resistance, that has advocated any sense that the Scottish independence movements should in some way fortify itself with weaponry. I've read people, and I do read people, and I understand where they're coming from, that say we maybe now need to move to an era of civic disobedience and not just simply accept the system that is in place just now, especially if we're not granted the Section 30 order from Westminster. I can understand those arguments, but by and large, the independence movement has been a democratic movement, and it's been a movement that's been in lots of ways gradualist. That frustrates people, but that's what Dr. King was about. He was a gradualist. He was trying to nudge change, edge things, insist that change happened in certain walks of life. So in that sense, we have got some similarities, although we ourselves as white men are clearly in the privileged end of that debate.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with everything you said there. And I think really the key thing is about that gradual movement towards independence. And it is a process, and it does take time, and it is a source of frustration for a lot of people. I mean, I've been in meetings where, you know, I've been talking and presenting information, and people have literally shouted at me because they've campaigned for this all their life. They're passionate about it.
Yes.
They're passionate about it for the right reasons, but they want it now. And sometimes I think that need and want for it straight away can sometimes cloud your vision about the process and the timing and just getting everything right.
Right. Yeah. And I think in lots of ways, for many of us, certainly for people of my age, you know, the next referendum, let's imagine it happens after the next Scottish elections and a date is identified. That for me becomes the most critical referendum in my lifetime. There probably isn't for me room for another couple, or, you know, so I kind of don't want to go down the kind of Canadian and route of there being endless referendums, or the Swiss route of having referendums about where you leave your key at your door. I want the biggie, and I want to win it, you know.
Yeah,
and I want Scotland to win it comfortably as well. I want it to be one of those ones where more than Brexit for me, so that all of the debates about validity of the victory are removed from the outset. That's important to me.
I think that's important for the country and how we move forward, that it is, you know, a decisive victory. And that's when we come back to that idea about trying to make things happen too quickly. What the potential for that is to divide people, and it means we might just get over the line. But you've seen what happened with Brexit and how that really sets two. It creates a chasm between different sides, and it's difficult to get past that. So
yeah, and theoretically, you know, I look at things like the United Nations Rights of Nations to self-determination and all of that, and you know, whilst I buy that and I believe it, I also know that we live in a world, we've seen it with the American elections, where they become vulnerable to legal challenge very quickly, and whilst the American elections and Donald Trump has kind of overdone the legal challenges, nonetheless, legal challenges can happen. So Scotland's referendum has to be beyond the range of challenge. It needs to set itself apart and say, this simply is world class in its standards, and there's no longer any debate. It's now about negotiating the settlement of our departure, where an awful lot of people will immediately say, yeah, well, that's quite fraught and whatever. There's a hell of a lot of strong cards that are in Scotland's hands for that negotiation, not least the way that the world negotiates independence legally, you know. So I think in lots of ways, getting over the referendum is, for me, the biggie. Because I don't doubt that we've got a lot of very smart people, some of whom are smart legally, others constitutionally, others just very clear about the sector that they work in. And I think we would put together a fairly formidable negotiation team to negotiate our independence. So we've got to get there to allow those people to shine, you know.
Oh, absolutely. And I think a lot of the work that has to be done now and the run up until that time when we can go to the polls and actually make a decision is about setting out a vision for the country that we want to be, because it's so important. I think far too much of the debate focuses on the procedure of it, about setting 30 in order and everything else. Whereas it's, for me and for a lot of the work we do with Voices for Scotland, it's about setting out the vision for the country that you want to see, not the country that politicians want to see, not the country that journalists want to see, but the country that the people of Scotland want to see.
Yeah. And I think you make a really, really good point there. And I'm sure it will be one that will be discussed, at the festival and in the kind of conversations that you provoke. The only thing I would say is you're quite clever and cute doing an online festival, but what currency will you use?
Well, that's a discussion for another time. But listen, I just want to thank you again for sitting down with me and having a conversation. Listen, anybody watching this, go and get this book. It's really, really good. It'll be a great Christmas present. It's a great read. Thank you so much for your time today, Stuart.
Allan, fantastic, and all the best. And let's get a drink when all this shit show's over.
That sounds brilliant. Thank you so much.
Okay, cheers, Allan. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.